A 27-year-old director with barely a feature film to his name set out to make a monster movie, and by the time it was over, he had accidentally invented the modern summer blockbuster. The shoot itself was a slow-motion disaster. The mechanical star of the film spent more time sinking than swimming, and somehow, out of all that chaos, the world got Jaws. Today we're counting down 15 strange, surprising, and occasionally horrifying facts about how this film actually got made. Stick around for the very end, because the most famous line in the entire movie might not have been written by anyone at all. Long before he built a galaxy far, far away, George Lucas was just a young filmmaker. There's a reason nobody looked at the ocean the same way after the summer of 1975. Anging around a friend's production, curious about how things work behind the scenes, while visiting the special effects workshop where the movie's mechanical shark was being assembled, Lucas leaned in for a closer look at the machinery packed inside its mouth. Someone nearby decided this was too good an opportunity to waste, and the jaws were triggered shut around his head. Unfortunately, the mechanism jammed, and it took several people scrambling to pry the metal jaws back open and free him. For a few tense moments, the crew thought they had just destroyed an enormously expensive prop before a single day of filming had even happened. Looking back, it's hard not to see it as a sign of things to come, because that same shark would spend the rest of production breaking down, sinking, and generally refusing to cooperate, forcing the entire film to be built around hiding it rather than showing it off. The original plan was modest, a 55-day shoot with a budget of roughly $4 million. What actually happened was closer to 160 days of filming and a final cost that crept toward the $10 million mark. Much of that overrun came from a decision that sounded bold on paper and turned into a nightmare in practice. Shooting almost entirely on the open Atlantic Ocean instead of a controlled studio tank, something no major Hollywood production had really attempted before. The ocean did not cooperate. Tides shifted mid-scene, random sailboats drifted into frame, and hours of careful setup could be ruined in seconds by a stray current. Then there was the mechanical shark itself, which spent more time sinking or seizing up than performing. Exhausted and increasingly bitter, the crew stopped calling the production Jaws and started calling it flaws instead. At one point, a top studio executive flew out personally, watched the shark flop uselessly belly up in the water, and offered the young director a graceful way out. Shut everything down, go home. No hard feelings. The offer was turned down, and filming continued on a project that almost everyone around it privately assumed was doomed to fail. The gruff, obsessive shark hunter at the center of the film almost didn't exist as we know him. The role was first offered to a well-known tough guy actor who turned it down for an oddly wonderful reason. He would rather go fishing for real than pretend to on camera. A second choice seemed perfect in tone and temperament, but scheduling made him unavailable. With just over a week left before cameras were set to roll, the part still had no one attached to it. A recommendation came in from people who had worked with a certain stage actor on a previous hit film, and that actor was eventually convinced to take the role, despite openly disliking the source novel and dismissing it as clumsy writing. It took some persistent persuading from people close to him before he agreed. There was also a financial complication running underneath the whole shoot. The actor had tax troubles back home and worried that a large American paycheck might draw unwanted attention, so he spent much of his time off flying out of the country just to limit the number of days he legally spent working in the United States. By some accounts, he ended up keeping only a small fraction of his earnings. Despite all of that, a classically trained stage performer who had never set foot on a real fishing vessel went on to define what a movie shark hunter was supposed to look. And so one of the film's central performances almost went to someone else entirely, because the actor eventually cast in the role rejected it not once, but twice before filming began. His reasoning at the time was almost comically dismissive. He said he would rather watch a shark movie than actually be in one, especially since he had just finished a lead role in another film he was convinced would make his career. Then he actually watched that other film, decided his performance in it was disastrous, and became genuinely afraid that the moment it hit theaters, his career would be over before it started. Suddenly, a shark picture didn't sound so bad. He called back, admitted he wanted the part after all, and was brought onto a production that had already started shooting, meaning he had almost no time to prepare before appearing on camera. His instincts about the shoot being miserable turned out to be entirely correct. Partway through filming, he even went on television and openly called the movie a disaster in the making, only to return to that same program after seeing an early cut and declare himself the most foolish actor working in America. None of that stopped his ambition, though. While still shooting this film, he was already campaigning for the lead role in the director's next project, going so far as to playfully talk down other actors who might be considered for it. By the time the film reached its first preview audience, the crew had spent so many months fighting a shark that refused to work properly that they genuinely weren't sure anymore whether the movie was actually frightening. The screening put those doubts to rest almost immediately. Unlike the director's previous film, which had played to a nearly silent audience from start to finish, this crowd reacted loudly and physically, gasping, screaming, and even throwing popcorn into the air during the tense moments. But the reaction that stuck with the director most involved something a little less glamorous. During one particularly upsetting scene involving a young boy, an audience member suddenly stood up and rushed toward the aisle. The director assumed he was witnessing his first walkout of the night. Instead, the man broke into a sprint, didn't quite make it to the restroom, and got sick right there in the theater. What happened next was the real surprise. A few minutes later, that same man calmly walked back in and retook his seat to finish watching the film. It was in that moment the filmmakers realized they had made something that could genuinely overwhelm an audience, and the only note that came out of the entire screening was a request for one additional scare before the film's release. The film's unforgettable opening sequence, in which a young woman goes for a late-night swim and is violently dragged through the water, was performed by a stunt professional and former competitive swimmer who essentially talked her way into the role. She wasn't cast through a typical audition process. The director had specifically sought out stunt performers because he knew the sequence would be physically brutal and wanted someone who could actually survive it. Her pitch to get the part was simple and direct. Hire a traditional actress, and she'll likely spend the whole scene hiding her face from the violence. Hire a stunt performer instead, and the camera can stay locked on her face the entire time. That argument won her the role. Filming the sequence took 3 full days. Metal plates were attached to her clothing and tied to ropes, and 2 teams of about 10 crew members each would haul her back and forth through the water to simulate something enormous, pulling her under. Apart from a pair of fins, she had no mechanical assistance, keeping her afloat between takes. She stayed above water through raw swimming strength alone. The director later called it one of the single most dangerous sequences he ever filmed, and there was no visual effects trickery involved at all, just rope, a large group of crew members, and one extremely capable swimmer refusing to give up. To get authentic footage of a real great white shark to intercut with the unreliable mechanical version, the production sent a pair of experienced Australian divers out to a well-known shark diving location. There was an immediate sizing problem. The mechanical shark had been built to represent a creature roughly 25 feet long, while the real sharks in that area tended to run closer to 15 feet. To make the real sharks appear more massive on camera, the crew built an undersized diving cage and hired an unusually short stand-in diver to sit inside it, since a smaller person next to a shark makes the animal look enormous by comparison. When the moment actually came, the stand-in got a look at the open water and lost his nerve, repeatedly stalling before finally admitting he couldn't swim well enough to go through with it. While the empty cage sat in the water, an actual great white became tangled in the rigging and began violently thrashing the entire structure apart, all while it was being filmed from both above and below the surface. One of the divers said afterward that if the stand-in diver had actually been inside the cage at that moment, he almost certainly would have died. His last-minute hesitation likely saved his life. The footage itself was too dramatic to leave unused, but because the cage on camera was clearly empty, the story had to be rewritten to match what had actually been filmed. In the original novel, the character trapped in that cage dies. In the finished film, he escapes through the wreckage and survives, all because of an accident nobody planned for. Filming on the open ocean meant filming in real weather with no safety net, and more than one vessel involved in the production ended up partially or fully underwater at some point. The worst incident came from a stunt gone wrong. To make the film's central boat appear to lurch violently, as if it had just been rammed by something enormous, the crew rigged a line to the stern and had a separate boat speed away to yank it taut. The effect worked far too well. The sudden force tore a plank clean out of the hull, and the boat began sinking with the actors still aboard, taking on water in a matter of minutes. As people called out for rescue, one of the production's veteran sound technicians reportedly made his priorities clear without hesitation, hoisting his recording equipment safely overhead while leaving the swimming to the actors themselves, a decision that became something of a legend on set. Once that same audio team went on to win major industry awards for their work. The cameras weren't spared either. On a separate occasion, expensive film footage went underwater along with its camera housing, and the crew had to think fast, packing the exposed reels in salt water rather than risk letting them dry out before they could be properly processed at a lab. Remarkably, the footage survived. On yet another day entirely, one of the film's writers narrowly avoided being pulled into a spinning boat propeller. By the end of the shoot, it had become something of a running joke that the actual ocean posed a bigger threat to the crew than the fictional shark ever did. For most of the finished film, audiences barely glimpsed the shark at all, and that wasn't a stylistic choice made from the start. It became a necessity born out of desperation. The mechanical shark used in production wasn't a single unit, but actually 3 separate full-scale pneumatic models, each about 25 feet long, built by a special effects veteran who had previously created large-scale creature effects for other major studio films. During testing in fresh water, the models performed reasonably well. Nobody, however, had accounted for what saltwater exposure would do to them once filming moved into the ocean. The results were brutal. Saltwater corroded internal components, seeped into pneumatic hoses, waterlogged the synthetic skin, and caused the paint to fade and peel. On the very first day of ocean filming, one of the 3 mechanical sharks sank straight to the bottom. Breakdowns became so frequent that entire shooting days were regularly lost, waiting for repairs. The director reportedly gave the whole apparatus an unflattering nickname behind the scenes, reflecting just how little patience remained for it. Once it became clear the shark simply wasn't going to reliably function, the entire filmmaking approach shifted around that limitation, leaning heavily on suggestion, point-of-view camera work, tight editing, and an ominous musical theme to create dread without needing to show the creature itself. The director has since suggested that if the shark had actually worked as intended, the film likely wouldn't have been nearly as frightening as it turned out to be. One of the film's most celebrated scenes very nearly fell apart before it was properly filmed. The actor delivering a lengthy, haunting speech about a real historical naval disaster decided that, since his character was supposed to be drinking heavily during the scene, he should actually drink beforehand to make the performance feel more authentic. The director reluctantly agreed to the plan, and it went badly. The actor became so intoxicated that crew members had to physically help him get back to shore, and the entire day's footage had to be scrapped entirely. Later that night, the director received an apologetic phone call from the actor, who genuinely couldn't remember anything that had happened on set and wanted to know what he'd missed. The next morning, sober and clearly embarrassed, he apologized again and delivered the scene cleanly in a single attempt, having also reworked much of the dialogue himself into the tighter, more powerful version that eventually made it to the screen. Crew members reportedly applauded once he finished. That same heavy drinking also fueled a running feud between him and one of his co-stars throughout filming, a tension that occasionally escalated into pranks and dares between them on set, including one particularly dramatic moment involving a thrown drink and a retaliatory blast from a fire extinguisher. The unforgettable monologue about a warship sinking and the sharks that followed wasn't invented for the film. It was inspired by the real sinking of a United States Navy vessel near the end of the Second World War, a disaster in which the majority of the crew died, many of them lost to shark attacks, while stranded in open water for days awaiting rescue. This entire backstory never appeared in the original novel the film was based on. It was added later during the screenwriting process. One writer first suggested tying the character's backstory to the real historical event and drafted an early version of the speech. Another collaborator then expanded it into a much longer monologue running many pages. Finally, the actor delivering the speech, himself an accomplished writer, trimmed and reshaped that draft into the tight, devastating version audiences actually hear in the finished film. To this day, there's genuine disagreement about who deserves the most credit for the final version, with the director describing it as a three-way collaboration, while others involved have offered differing accounts. What's certain is that a piece of real wartime history became one of the most quietly terrifying scenes in the movie, without a single shark appearing on screen. The sudden appearance of a dead sailor's disfigured face inside a sunken, wrecked boat hull remains one of the most talked about jump scares in the entire film, and it almost didn't happen at all. When the studio declined to fund an additional scare for the movie, the director chose to pay for it himself, spending a few $1,000s of his own money to shoot the moment in a colleague's backyard swimming pool. The crew mixed powdered milk into the water to recreate the murky look of the ocean, sank a section of wrecked boat hull into the pool, and used a detailed cast made from the head of a local fisherman who had already influenced another character's mannerisms elsewhere in the film. The editor who assembled the sequence later called it the most satisfying edit of her entire career, and she went on to win a major industry award for her editing work on the film overall. At the next test screening, the moment sent the entire audience jumping out of their seats, arguably a bigger physical reaction than the actual shark ever managed to produce elsewhere in the movie, all from a scene filmed in an ordinary backyard pool. Very little about the film's score suggested, on paper, that it would become one of the most recognizable pieces of music in movie history. While editing the film, the director had been using a temporary score borrowed from another composer's earlier, more experimental work, expecting the final music to sound similarly strange and otherworldly. Instead, the composer sat down at a piano and played just two alternating notes using two fingers. The director's first reaction was to laugh, assuming this was the setup for a joke, and that something more elaborate was coming. It wasn't a joke. The composer played it completely straight, insisting that this simple, repetitive motif was the actual theme. On a second listen, it clicked, and the director realized that the simplicity itself was exactly what made it work. Those two notes ended up giving the shark a musical identity that the unreliable mechanical prop never managed to achieve on its own, and the score went on to win the composer a major industry award, remaining widely regarded as one of the greatest film scores ever written. In an amusing side note, the same composer wanted one specific music cue, a small-town parade band, to sound deliberately amateurish rather than polished, so the director himself, a rusty former high school clarinet player, volunteered to play a few off-key measures that reportedly remain in the finished film. On the morning that award nominations were announced, the director was so confident that his film would sweep nearly every category that he arranged to have a film crew capture his live reaction on camera. Beforehand, he predicted double-digit nominations and a dominant overall performance. As the nominees for Best Director were read aloud one by one, name after name was announced, none of them his. The cameras caught his expression change in real time as he realized